Hi, my name is Emma Bacon. I'm the Executive Director of Sweltering Cities, founder and Executive Director. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're, again, meeting on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. And also say that a lot of the work we do is about urban heat and about our physical environment. And if we're looking at those issues, the origin of so many of them is colonisation and what we've done to the environment since then. But also, in the same way that that's the origin of a lot of the problems, so we should be looking to Aboriginal people in terms of leadership to solve those problems when it comes to planning our cities, when it comes to creating community health programs and things like that. So, as I said, I'm the Executive Director of Sweltering Cities. We work with communities impacted by extreme heat on campaigns and advocacy for more livable, equitable and sustainable cities. I was asked today to talk a bit about extreme heat as sort of a big picture issue, the health impacts, the social impacts, things like that, and also a little bit about our work and the emerging Greater Melbourne Heat Alliance that's going to be kicking off next year. It is very much emerging, but I really wanted you guys to be able to know a little bit more about it as it's kicking off. So, the system works. Here we go. So heat waves are our deadliest environmental disaster. They kill more people than all the others combined. The deaths and the morbidity is also vastly underestimated. There's suggestions from some academics it could be many multiple times worse because we don't measure it very effectively. We've been recently working with someone from the Nepean, one of the Western Sydney local health districts, who's been comparing data for how many heat deaths were registered in their local area. That's Penrith, that's where it gets to almost 50 degrees. And then she went through the clinical notes and she found people who, were working outside, passed out, ended up in hospital, and they weren't, on a really hot day, and they weren't being recorded as a heat-related issue. So we know that part of the problem is we're underestimating it because they're not being recorded systematically as heat-related illnesses. This map is from the summer of 2019-2020. So December 17th was the hottest recorded day in Australia on record. That's the average temperature across the across the country that day. And we saw a lot of these type of really terrifying maps that summer, and we broke a lot of heat records. Again, in Penrith and Western Sydney, it reached 48.9 degrees, which is a sort of temperature where it's dangerous to go outside for almost anyone. Since then, we've had 3 La Nina years, which is a lot, very, very wet, very humid and sticky. I know from my experience last year, we work across Sydney and Melbourne, and everyone in Melbourne last year was like, we are not used to your Sydney humidity, please take it away. But since then, we've also had COVID. People have a lot more health vulnerabilities, people have had to stay inside, they're a lot more wary of public spaces. We've also continued to have a housing affordability crisis in the country where people are, insecure in their homes, people are struggling to pay the bills, and the cost of living crisis is rising. This is, I guess, was intended to, not that we need it, but give a sense of urgency. Our general understanding of how bad extreme heat is, does not take into account how bad it's going to get. We are looking at every summer, heat records will be broken. We're going to use the word unprecedented a lot, and we're going to see a continuation of this because of rising temperatures due to climate change. But we know that heat-related disease and heat-related issues aren't just to do with temperature. They're also to do with structural inequalities that make people vulnerable. It's about where you live, it's about your income, it's about your health, it's about your gender, which Margarita's going to speak about, and all these other factors that make us vulnerable. In 2003, in France, 14,000 people died in one summer due to extraordinary high temperatures. But it wasn't just because of the temperatures, it's also because the people there weren't used to responding to heat. So they'd left a lot of older people at home as people had gone on holidays. People were living in apartments that were really unsafe in those temperatures. So it's not just about how hot it gets, it's also how capable people are to respond to it. What happens to our bodies when it gets really hot? I'm going to go very briefly over heat exhaustion and heat stroke because I think that I've been doing this work for 3 or 4 years, and even I really didn't understand until I went over it with people, how dire heat-related disease can get incredibly quickly. So heat exhaustion is when, we get dehydrated due to high temperature, physical activity, people get headaches, they're dizzy, they'll be sweating a lot, their body is really trying to cool itself. And in those sort of circumstances, we need to make sure people, giving them water if they're awake. We've been needing to, cool people down, letting them sit, fanning them, things like that, trying to help them cool their body temperatures. And if it deteriorates people, we need to call 000. If you see people in these sort of circumstances, it's not worth just saying, oh, have a drink of water and sit down. We need to treat these sort of diseases as medical emergencies, treat these instances as medical emergencies. And then we've got heat stroke. And heat stroke leads to fatalities. So in that sort of situation, you've got life-threatening, our bodies can no longer regulate our temperatures. We're looking at body temperatures that are over 40 degrees. People will be no longer sweating. They can't cool themselves anymore. They'll be losing consciousness, getting agitated, things like that. And in those sort of situations, we just need to be calling 000 straight away. And I think, the purpose of saying this, you should look at the Red Cross. Other people have much better resources than this. But the purpose of saying this was to really give the sense that feeling hot is not about being uncomfortable for a lot of people. It's actually life-threatening situations. But it's not just our physical health that's impacted by extreme heat, it's also our mental health. So we've been collecting stories of how people feel in the heat. People have been reporting to us that they feel claustrophobic at home, they're isolated because they don't feel safe to go out. They're not running errands, so they're not going sometimes and getting the prescription refills for their mental health medications. Sleeplessness is a huge issue. People have reported to us they feel financial stress because they're arguing with their family about whether they should be putting on the aircon or not. And also dealing with kids when you're not, feeling comfortable letting them outside for, days at a time, and the stress that puts on families. Statistically, we know that suicides, mental health presentations, domestic violence, and assaults all go up in higher temperatures. And so, we also need to be taking into account that there is these really intense mental health impacts. Who is vulnerable? Put a list here. I added this quote because it's stuck with me for about 3 years. I'm just going to read it because I put a lot of text, so I'm not sure you're all reading it now. But this is from Andrew from Oxley Park. I'm a disability support worker, and the people I work with talk to me about the heat. If they have to go to the shops, they're walking or taking public transport. They know to be careful of what they wear, to take water and try to stay in the shade. If they don't take enough water, it's the added cost of needing to buy more. In the heat, they need to plan extra hard just to get the necessities of living. A trip to the closest shops might mean 20 or 30 minutes in the heat. I hear all the time that people wait for days to see if it gets cooler. They say they can't go out in the heat because it's too much when it's in the 30s and 40s. They know it's dangerous in the heat. And one of the things that really stuck with me from that conversation with Andrew, who was talking about people he worked with, was that people are trying to do the right things. They know that it's dangerous. They know they need water, and they know they can't go out at certain times of day, and that they should be staying inside. But when you don't have a lot of money for extra food, when you don't have a lot of storage of things at your home that you can rely on, when your home is a hot box, it's unsafe to be in, giving people advice saying, turn on the fan, put a wet towel on the back of your neck, these are really inadequate. And the people are trying their best. I think is something really important to remember in a lot of circumstances. These are lists of people this is a brief list of people who are vulnerable to heat-related disease. Something that I've become more across recently is the issue of people who take medications, whether that's antidepressants, antipsychotics, a whole lot of different medications, change the way our bodies can regulate temperatures. But people who get given those medications, get prescribed them, aren't often told that they might be more vulnerable in the heat. And so there's, people we understand as being vulnerable to extreme heat, but actually it's a much larger list than a lot of us understand, including little kids, pregnant people, a whole lot of others. And it's not just about our physical circumstances, it's also about where we live. So this is a photo that was sent to me last summer from a nurse who lives in Melbourne. And, she was doing a lot of work because she was working with people with COVID and, really having a hard time at work. And she went home, from night shifts or during the day, and her walls, all glass. her room, her and her girlfriend, got extremely hot. And this was the only thing they could think of in order to, they're putting bubble wrap, alfoil in order to make their home safe. Because they can't install changes in their homes to make it more heat resilient because they're renters. So and so she's actually recently gotten in contact with her real estate agent and said, it's unlivably hot here, we'd really like to install some curtain rails. This is so basic, right? Like, this isn't saying, we want aircon, we want solar panels, it's saying, we would love some curtain rails. And the real estate agent said no. They said, but if you do want to install them, you can put them up, but you have to remove them at the end and put the house into the exact same, put the apartment into the exact same condition that you got it. So if she did install curtain rails, they're at her own expense, she's then got to take them away and she might be forfeiting her bond, at the end of that time. And this is a situation renters are in. And partly that's because the minimum standards for renters say you need curtains that block light and have privacy that have nothing to do with heat. There's nothing to do with having a safe, cool home in the summer. That's something we really need to change. And this is also, on top of people who are in private rentals, then you've got people who are in public housing. And there's people here from CoHealth who are much more experts in this than me. But we did a bit of work at the beginning of the year about the community rooms at the bottom of the apartment buildings for over 55s. And they were closed in March 2020 for COVID-based safety reasons. And at the beginning of 2022, they still weren't open because they'd fallen through the cracks of the administration. We contacted the Department of Health. They said it's a local problem. It's about policies. So I was like, who can we talk to? Oh, we can't really tell you who to talk to. It's just a local thing, but we're not going to do anything about it. And so people were leaving their apartment buildings, and instead of going somewhere safe at the bottom of their apartment buildings, they were spending their days in the pokies rooms or in shopping centres, drinking coffee all day. And I would say that anyone who lives in public housing who's over 55, we can just say they're vulnerable to heat-related disease. And it is totally inadequate to say that those people shouldn't have a safe local place to go during the heat. Last summer, we did a huge community survey across the country of how people feel the heat. We spoke to 2,100 people across the country in every state and territory, and across almost 700 individual postcodes. Here are a few of the results. We found that just over 30% of people are leaving their homes to get relief from the heat. So that means going to libraries, shopping centres, places like that. I don't know if any of you have been to a shopping centre recently, but next time you do, have a walk around and have a look at how many seats there actually are anymore in shopping centres and how comfortable it would be to spend the day there. And so that's a real problem. That's not actually a good solution to say people should go to shopping centres. We saw that people are having trouble sleeping, and that's one of my, I think, most important statistics, that over 80% of people are having trouble sleeping because that does impact us at work, it impacts our mental health, our physical health, puts a lot of pressure on our bodies. And this is not a small minority of people who are being impacted by that. That is almost all of us. And I always do this, but has anyone had trouble sleeping on a hot night or during a heat wave? Yeah, this is not about impacts for other people, it's about impacts for all of us. People are avoiding walking, they're avoiding exercise, leaving the house. This is especially true for older people. People are aware that the way their suburb is built increases heat. People are living in urban heat islands and they can feel it. I'll go into what urban heat islands are in a sec, but people are very aware of that. And we found that over 60% of people with aircon said they have concerns about costs that stop them turning it on. So we know that air conditioning by itself is not a solution. We also need to either provide funding for people to be able to turn it on so they're not worried about their next electricity bill, or make sure that, especially when we're installing aircon in public housing and social housing, affordable housing, that it always has renewable energy attached to it so that people don't have to be worrying about whether they can afford to stay safe during heat waves. It's getting worse, is basically what this graph says. I think one of the statistics I found really interesting was that summers in Melbourne are now a month longer than they used to be. So our concept of when is a dangerous time should be expanding. And we know that the more fossil fuels we burn will have a direct impact on the number of extreme heat days that we experience here and around the world. Urban heat islands. This is an aerial photo from Werribee. And so you can see the different eras of development in this area. We're in the top part of the photo, you've got smaller houses, lots of different coloured roofs, you've got trees, backyards, and then you can see the bottom part where there are almost no trees in this area. You've got big blocks of dark roofs, lots of concrete. So an urban heat island is an area where you've got very few trees, you've got lots of concrete that absorbs heat and then radiates it out over the night, so you get high, you don't have minimums, you have high temperatures, great. That's my 5 minutes to go, Mark. And you've got dark roofs and lots of dark surfaces that attract heat. So urban heat island areas can be 5, 10 or even 15 degrees hotter than cooler areas that have trees or are by the coast and things like that. If you're thinking urban heat areas in Melbourne, it's the west, it's the north, and it's around Dandenong. This is from 2018. It's the percentages in each region of tree cover across Melbourne. So you can see that in the areas that aren't urban heat islands, like the eastern area, lots of trees, compared to the western area where there's only 5%. And part of that is because a lot of that area was grassland, it wasn't forest to begin with, but still like grassland or wildflower meadows, as I think they more correctly can be called, still, they absorb carbon, they absorb heat, and they aren't urban heat island areas. So we can't think of those stretches in the west that don't have trees as empty. They serve a really important purpose of cooling the air. And we shouldn't be doing, endless infill of concrete because it will just heat up the entire area. I think there's plans to do something about this, but whenever you hear an announcement saying, we're going to plant 5,000 trees, 6,000 trees, we need a lot more than that, and it needs to be part of the planning controls, not a, Band-Aid solution afterwards. One of the big problems when it comes to extreme heat is that we treat it like an individual problem. So the advice is, keep yourself cool, go somewhere cool, towel around your neck, as I said, turn on the fans. We know these issues are happening to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people at a time. And so if we treat it like an individual problem, we have small-scale solutions. If we understand that these are huge problems, we can be ambitious. These statistics are from the State of Environment report. You can see in Melbourne, we're projected to have a doubling of heat-related deaths by 2050. And in places like Brisbane, it's going to increase 500% by 2050. It's also 38 degrees in Brisbane on this Thursday, so they're already feeling the heat this year. Even though it's quite cool here, it's still already an issue around the country. So we need to understand that heat is a collective issue, and we do that at Sweltering Cities by telling stories, by sharing the statistics, doing community research, and talking about how this is a big issue that needs ambitious solutions. It's also extremely complex, and there's a whole lot of different issues. I've put in a few posts that we did last summer on social media. One's about pets. People are worried that if they go somewhere to keep cool, they'll be leaving their pets at home, and they might die. I've heard really tragic stories about people going to work and coming back and their dog has died during the day on a hot day, really, and extremely upsetting for people. In Victoria, the average home energy efficiency rating is 1.8, which is pretty close to a tent. Next year we're upgrading the national standards to 7 stars, but that doesn't mean that we need to actually be retrofitting older homes in order to make them safe. Plastic grass is a real nightmare. Don't put it in. I could talk for a lot longer about that. It can get to 80 degrees. You can burn your hands in 3 seconds on fake plastic turf on a hot day. Really, it's a whole nightmare. I'll talk about that in the morning tea. Sweltering Cities, what we do is we build community power, we run tangible campaigns for strategic tangible campaigns that will change the way we'll talk about heat waves, and we amplify and tell stories about extreme heat so that people don't feel alone, and so decision makers can really understand how bad the situation is. These are our 3 campaigns coming up. One is just in New South Wales at the moment, but we'd like to expand it. It's called Busted Bus Stops. Basically, in some of the hottest areas of Sydney, the bus stops are a pole, the side of the road, and they provide no shade, no shelter. It means people can't leave the house, and it means that people are actually at risk of heat-related disease just from commuting or sunburn and things like that. We've got Burning Up, which is about how we need to not just alert people to the fact extreme heat is coming, we need to not just tell people about heat waves in a better way, but we also need to match that with services. So as I've said, people are trying their best. We need to actually increase mental health support, we need to increase health outreach, we need to actually make sure there's cool, safe spaces in order to keep people safe. And the last one is about cooler suburbs. We're saying that we should make sure that our building standards at the moment and our infrastructure standards meet two key measures. One is that they've got to fit within a 2050 net zero carbon emissions goal, and the second is that they've got to be safe in our changing climate, because at the moment our building standards, so our basic standards, is set towards a 1965 to 1990 climate, and next year it's going to be updated to 1990 to 2015, which doesn't include some of the hottest years on record, including the slide from my very first slide about 2019. So we say that we should be measuring all built environment and infrastructure measures against future climates to make sure they're safe for everyone. I'm going to really quickly go. We have just got some funding. We've just got some support to be setting up the Greater Melbourne Heat Alliance. We want to be bringing together everyone who's working on this issue across local government, state government, organisations like yours, doctors, ambulance people, lots of different types of sectors to actually be talking about these issues, coordinating, sharing information, and ideally doing some strategic advocacy to make sure that decision makers are hearing loud and clear what the solutions are. So, you'll hear more about that in the future next year. This is a bleak Simpsons meme that I put at the end. I asked my friend if this is okay. They were like, yeah, it's fine. But this is also, this is an urgent issue. We should not be waiting until there is a deadly summer and thousands of deaths before we actually start to take this seriously. Heat waves are environmental disasters where we know when and where they're going to happen, and we can plan for them. And so we need to be doing that now. And that's why we need to be telling decision makers that they've got to act for safer suburbs, for safer homes, for better health outreach, and to make sure our most vulnerable aren't left struggling to take care of themselves in those situations. So that's all from me. I meant to put my email up here. I'm emma@swelteringcities.org. So if you'd like to talk about this more, or fake grass, or anything else, please get in touch. Thanks very much.